No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busy themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Get across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish. Intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. That is the opening paragraph of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Your Sunday Penguin for today. Welcome, my friends. Welcome to the Rustic Vaughn Lodge. And I'm here in the least terrifying room of the Rustic Vaughn Lodge, here in my cozy kitchen. It's still pretty early. It's about 5 o'clock here in California. And we are just hanging out, talking about H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, one of the early science fiction classics, one of the very first alien invasion stories, certainly the first major alien invasion story. This is a fantastic novel. It was released in 1897, so right before the turn of the century. At that time, just like 20 years ago, the idea of the apocalypse and the end of everything that was on a lot of people's minds, I guess because, the universe cares about our human calendar. It doesn't. But, I guess around the turn of the century, that's how people start to think. So this book came out at the perfect time. It was the height of the British Empire. Britain was running around, stomping all over smaller countries. And H.G. Wells got to thinking, hey, what if something like that were to happen to us? And so it does in this horrifying story. H.G. Wells did speculate, what would it be like if we were colonized and taken over? And, how horrible that would be. And yeah, it's pretty terrible. So this is a story of the Earth being invaded by Martians. And Mars has superior technology. They land on Earth in different large cylinders, creating big pits in Woking. One of these cylinders lands. And this story is told from the perspective of just a regular middle-class guy who lives there in the suburbs. We don't learn too much about him. We know he's married, but we don't know too much about this guy. We don't know his name. Well, that's really not important. You barely notice that. In fact, it's told as a memoir of the events of this catastrophic war and what our narrator saw. And it also goes into a little bit of what his brother saw in London. And you don't, like I said, you don't need to know too much about this narrator because H.G. Wells pretty much puts himself in the narrator's place. The narrator is basically H.G. Wells. It's told about the invasion from where he lived at the time. He would walk around the neighborhood and kind of check it out and say, hey, this would be a good place for Martians to destroy. It does have an immediacy because of that. The main character, even though we don't know who this guy is, seems like a real guy because he is. He's H.G. Wells, basically. And so the Martian cylinder crash lands, it creates this big pit. It unscrews, and the gross octopus-like Martians flop out. They're a little hampered because our gravity is stronger than that of Mars. But they don't care. They put together a death ray, a heat ray, which they promptly turn on everybody that's checking out the pit. A bunch of people around there looking in, trying to figure out what this thing is and just hang out. Martians put up the death ray, kill him, and cause everybody to run in panic. And then the Martians create or put together their huge robotic tripod vehicles. These huge death machines on 3 legs that go stomping across the English countryside, armed with a death ray. It's great. It's fantastic. It has a real sense of realism and immediacy. H.G. Wells pictured all this really well. And I think it has a real sense of reality to it. It doesn't read like it was written 100 years ago. Of course, the language and everything is different than it as if it were written today, but it does have an immediacy and a realism that it doesn't seem dated. When you read this, it is really well written, and you forget you're just like the best stories. When you read it, you forget that you're reading a story, and while you're reading it, it seems real, and that is the wonderful thing about fiction when it's really, really well written and when it has a great concept, and that's what this has. This works as a great early science fiction novel. It also works really well as an early horror novel. Not just because of the huge catastrophe that happens. We put up a fight, us human beings, but we're just no match for the Martians. So it doesn't take long for them to just stomp all over the country and take over. And the Martians themselves are horrifying and gross and terrifying. And so when it comes to the Martians, that really pushes this into a horror novel level, because these creatures are just terrifying. And not only do they want to defeat us and take over our planet, they want to harvest us as food. So it's pretty bad for us poor humans. And we get some great battle scenes in here of the Martians taking over and stomping into London, and it's great. Trust me. This isn't one of those books you can spoil too much because it's pretty much straightforward about the Martians coming and taking everything over. The exciting part is just witnessing that, because you really feel like a witness to these events. It's told, like I said, mostly from the narrator's perspective. He talks a little bit from his brother's perspective in London. But it all has that sense of, hey, this really happened, at least while you're reading it. So it's great. Fantastic, fantastic book that works on multiple levels. There's many critiques of human society in here, and of the British Empire in particular. At least you can read it that way, and I think it was meant to be read that way, at least in part. Because H.G. Wells, he thought about that stuff. He speculated all the time about human society. And you get the feeling that at the end of this book, human beings are actually more thoughtful and perhaps a little better for their experience. I don't think it's spoiling too much to say that the human beings, they do not defeat the Martians. They survive the Martians. The ending of this is pretty clever. It's a pretty clever ending. It's really worth your time to read. If somehow if you've not read this book, read this book. This book is fantastic. It's one of those essential horror science fiction reads, you know. Which means that if you're into horror and if you're into science fiction, heck, if you're just into literature, read this book because it's a classic of all those, you know. It's that kind of storytelling that makes it's up there with I Am Legend, for example, as a story of a catastrophe, a great science fiction story that's really, really gripping. So yeah, War of the Worlds. It's not very long. It's a short little book. You can get through it really quick because it just rockets along, the plot does. And it's fantastic stuff. So yeah, War of the Worlds, your Sunday Penguin for today. Catch me tomorrow when I'll be back for Mythos Monday, where we'll be talking about H.P. Lovecraft's The Outsider. Okay guys, I will catch you next time.